Evening, everyone. Welcome to our last lecture, sadly. I've loved doing this series. I really appreciate all of you coming out each week. And we've covered a lot of ground, but I think that tonight, covering the sort of 80s and 90s at Cranbrook, this was certainly my favorite lecture to put together so far, because this is the era that hasn't been written about yet. And so this was a lot of meeting minutes and archival research and talking to those of you who were here for it, and putting together some conclusions that haven't been made about Eliel Saarinen for once. After the lecture series, do keep in touch. All of you who bought the ticket, you are signed up for our email, so you'll get those on Wednesday. There's the Japanese event cultural activities that are coming up. There's a couple of spots left for the dinner next Sunday in the boys' dining hall. And then starting in May, there'll be an exhibition in Saarinen House that I'm curating about the craftspeople and the builder of Saarinen House. And then there'll also be the regularly scheduled tours of Smith House, the Frank Lloyd Wright House, the Saarinen House, and then through the House and Gardens Auxiliary Cranbrook House. I'm also happy to announce that we're going to do a tour series to complement this lecture series. Thank you, yes. And so those will be in the warmer months. I will lead them. They will likely include lunch, and we'll probably do multiple tours covering parts of the campus that aren't usually open, including the buildings that we see tonight. Next, I want to thank some people. I want to thank the photographers, both in the past, like George Hance and Harvey Crows and Balthazar Korab, and in the present, like P.D. Rierick and Jim Hafner, and my student worker, Daniel Smith, who have taken so many of the contemporary color photos. I also want to thank the staff of the center, Alyssa, Matt, and Lynette at the front desk, Mike and his staff in the booth, and then especially I want to thank the archivist, particularly Laura McNewman, for answering all of my really in-the-weeds questions, where we have to go to far off-site storage to find boxes that I'm not sure have been opened in 20 years. And also thank all of you for coming. Let's get started. So tonight's lecture is another one that's going to focus largely on Cranbrook, but what I find fascinating about the buildings that were built here between 1990 and 2002 is that it's a moment in history where we see architecture as this sort of battle of the styles taking place, and we see those battles taking place here at Cranbrook. Instead of placing the buildings with sort of arbitrary examples out there in the world, we actually had so many architects who were coming to campus for job interviews just by showing the projects that they showed in order to get work here. I think that we'll see the sort of tapestry of building that was happening in America and in the world in the 1990s. This moment that was after postmodernism, after modernism, what to build and why. Last week we saw Edison House, which is Cranbrook's great example, only example of mid-century modernism. The next style that takes place in the history of architecture is postmodernism, and we don't have any postmodernism here on campus, much to my chagrin, though I think that all of the buildings tonight could be read as postmodern buildings. So when we left off, we had Eliel and Arrow, Eliel's last great building, his sort of temple to art and culture and education. And then we had Arrow, one of his last buildings, the Gateway Arch, this sort of American monument temple to sort of both the American century and to Jefferson's expansion. Where was architecture going to go from this sort of heroic era of the 1950s, this era teeming with shapes? Well, Arrow's office was a major stimulus in the search for new architectural expressions appropriate to the 1960s and 70s. His office attracted people of unique and unusual talent, like Gunnar Burkertz and his Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. After Burkertz left the Saarinen office after Saarinen's death, he also built buildings like the Law School Library at University of Michigan. big buildings, structurally expressive, digging into the earth, hanging from the sky. Other graduates of Cranbrook and the Saarinen Office included Edward Charles Bassett of Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, who create this unique sort of corporate architecture for the suburbs. Most famously, Kevin Roach and John Dinkloo, who are really the ones who take over the Saarinen Office and run it through last year when that office closed, and their famous Ford Foundation building next to Grand Central, which is this internal park enclosed in glass and the skyscraper pushed entirely to the inside of the block. Roach and Dinkloo would also build other sort of mammoth forms, these pyramids on the outskirts of Indianapolis. But by the late 60s, you're beginning to see influences of tradition with their United Nations edition, where you have this sort of neoclassical in green marble and mirror. And the postmodernists would begin mining traditional architectural forms, people like Cesar Pelli, who worked in the Saarinen office from the late 50s through its closing, in his Blue Whale in Los Angeles. And most famously, he worked in the Aero Saarinen office for 2 years, Robert Venturi, who by 1964 has kicked off postmodernism with his mother's house, a house that looks like a house, that has iconography. It is centered on a chimney. It is no longer abstraction and modernism. It is something different and more in touch with history. But if Venturi is at the forefront of the postmodernist and bringing meaning back into architecture, the vast majority of architects were still practicing in this more abstract style. People like Glen Paulson, who worked in the Saarinen office and who came to Cranbrook in 1965, the year he built Shapiro Hall of Pharmacy, first as head of the architecture department at Cranbrook and then as president of the Academy of Art. And his buildings are pretty typical of the age. They came in on budget, and those budgets were usually small. His sort of fortress of science at the University of Detroit. You see this real interest in primal shapes, the building as a sort of mammoth block sitting in the landscape. And then when he's challenged to do a school, he still uses these primal shapes, these little domes that are actually made of styrofoam covered in concrete. And then his last significant work, the Federal Building in Ann Arbor, which I use as just an example of where American architecture was in the Carter administration. And here at Cranbrook, he builds Gordon Hall of Science in 1976. You see it faces off from Saarinen's boys' school, going due north, this strip of glass, a skylight, and then brick that he said was emulating Saarinen's brick. But even from this photograph, I think you can tell the sort of variety and modulation of Saarinen's brick from the 20s versus Paulson's in 1976. And then the two doors face off, Saarinen's study hall door looking back to Glen Paulson. And moving inside of the building, it was originally conceived as being 2 stories, and so it actually is built robust enough that the second floor could be built and a stairway plopped through the lobby here. But I think you see Paulson using light, using materials as very abstract concepts. This is a blocky building, and so he sits 50 years later than Eliel Saarinen, and he sort of looks out of the building, and I just think that Paulson must have thought what a different world it was for Eliel, what opportunity he had, that just now, because of the modernist zeitgeist, because of cost and because of materials, I can't do that anymore. And so we move from Edison House of the mid-century modern, Paulson's late modern abstraction of the science building for the School for Boys. And I want to just quickly review where we are in Cranbrook's history at this point, the late 70s. We still have the meeting house where Brookside School is taking place. Christchurch Cranbrook is still a part of Cranbrook's community. The School for Boys operates out of its Saarinen's campus. The School for Girls out of its Saarinen's campus. The Institute of Science, which by this point, the 70s, has had multiple additions onto it, and the Art Academy, which has had virtually nothing added to it. It was 6 separate institutions here at 1970 with 6 separate governance structures, 6 separate ground crews, 6 separate accountants, 6 separate institutions all on one campus. Everything was separate, including their mission. They were really kind of working at odds to each other in a lot of ways. No one knew what the other divisions were doing. Famously, the Art Academy sells off the Booth collection of art in the early 70s. And even though it was now a world of color, there was a big change afoot. And in 1973, the Cranbrook Foundation that George had set up in 27 to be the head leader of all 6 institutions was dissolved, and Cranbrook Educational Community was formed. And so with that formation, it gave us a central office. It also gave us a president. It also saw the church spin off into its own division. And so we traded religion for bureaucracy. And here comes Dr. Lillian Powder in. Dr. Powder was a New Yorker. She had her PhD in sociology from Michigan. She was the Dean of Liberal Arts at University of Detroit when she came to Cranbrook in 1983, first as director of schools and then as president of Cranbrook Educational Community. She was president from 1984 until 1996, and in that time, she oversaw a massive rehabilitation of the campus, both its architecture, but also its finances. She oversaw the sale of the Evening News Association stock in 1985, which strengthened the community's financial future and established a new era of investing and fundraising at Cranbrook. She was the first president to take a very strong position on the centrality of one Cranbrook, that we were one community and we needed to move as one. Early on, Dr. Powder worked to have Cranbrook noted as a National Historic Landmark, and our landmark status does cover the entire community. But most importantly for our lecture tonight, she initiated a period of architectural expansion and preservation of the campus's buildings and landscapes. The first building built after Dr. Powder arrives is the one we're sitting in here, the Desalle Auditorium, designed by Eliel Saarinen's grandson by way of Pipson and Bob Swanson, Robert Saarinen Swanson. And so we see the art museum, you see the front of the Orpheus Fountain, and we are slipped in between the two. Remember that the columns are structural, so those columns back there are holding the weight of the museum now, and we do not go under the Orpheus Fountain, so the fountain did not have to be dug up. The building is a little bit deeper than what you see here. So there's vaults where there used to be paintings back there. There's a little recording studio under this side, the conference room, and then an emergency exit that pops out behind me and up the stairs on the front. Here you see Bob Swanson with Betty Williams, who is Todd Williams' mother and was a major collector and trustee of the Academy, with Cranbrook's then president, Roy Slade. Roy Slade was a painter. He came to Cranbrook from the Corcoran in 1977, and he served as president of the Art Academy from 1977 until 1994. And he helped to instigate a whole new era at the Academy of Art as well. Here is construction of Desalle Auditorium, and Swanson worked with parking deck contractors and engineers. So we were essentially in a parking structure. It's supporting the roof above us. While it was under construction, the Orpheus Fountain was restored. So the base wasn't touched, but the sculptures themselves were restored. And then here is the finished building, completely invisible from the outside, except for these two little vent hoods that are venting the mechanical area on this side of the room, which I think they have this sort of great abstract sculptural quality. It is really an architecture of sculpture. Nearby, Roy Slade was living in Saarinen House. In 1977, he renovated the house with Carl Magnusson, who is the head designer at Knoll. And then, as he had filled it with sort of Jacqueline or Larson carpet and all these mid-century modern pieces, working with the curator at the museum, Greg Whitcop, they started making it closer to Saarinen's vision. At first, it was just becoming a nicer place for Roy Slade, president, to live, but eventually Greg challenged his boss and said, "We can do this right, kick you out of the house, and do a full restoration into a museum." And so in 1994, Saarinen's great Art Deco masterpiece was restored and opened to the public. And here is a nice PR photo of Greg and Roy Slade. At the same time, the departments at Cranbrook were flourishing, with Catherine and Michael McCoy at the head of design. Here's a program catalog from the 1980s. Daniel Liebskin, seen on the far right, was head of the architecture department, and he brought to Cranbrook this deconstructivist moment. He never built anything at Cranbrook because in the era of Liebskin drawing like this, he wasn't building anything. He was a paper architect. What he did oversee was the construction of this model made by the students for the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and a major retrospective at the Met in the 1980s. Roy Slade was staying in the hotel across the street from the Met when he got a call from Philippe de Montebello, who said, "Look out your window," and they rolled down this banner on the center door of the Met. In the exhibit, it was a real celebration of everything that we've talked about in this lecture series: the design, the architecture, the history of creation here at Cranbrook. It solidified Cranbrook's role as forming mid-century modernism and of being a sort of singular place in the history of art. It took place in the American wing by Kevin Roach, and it saw the publication of the Cranbrook Bible, Design in America. So this is the text that you must get for the early decades of Cranbrook. But while all of this celebration was happening and all of this sort of looking back and studying the past, which had not been here in the 70s. In the 70s, people were not walking around praising Saarinen's name. While all of this was happening in sort of academia and in the museum, the campus itself was really falling apart. It was really suffering. Here you have Saarinen's door just completely ruined. And so Dr. Powder set up to come to create Cranbrook's first master plan, which was called the Cranbrook Vision, published in 1986. And she worked with the architects Helmuth Obata and Kasselbaum, HOK, particularly with Goryeobata, who was a Cranbrook graduate. And they looked at the existing site plan of Cranbrook with its 6 institutions, only recently joined as one, 6 different ways in and out, and 6 sort of sets of crumbling architecture. And they proposed a number of changes, moving all of the schools to the Cranbrook campus and turning Kingswood into unknown, but moving all academic activities down here, adding on studios for the Art Academy, adding on galleries for the Institute of Science, and most importantly, bringing a road out of campus across this Alfred Taubman-owned subdivision into Woodward Avenue. This had been discussed for almost 30 years by this point. Goryeobata, we saw last week his chapel in St. Louis. By this point, he was head of what was becoming one of America's largest architecture firms, and the proposals here are really speculative. They're meant to create excitement, so none of these projects were ever brought into sort of design documents. But here's a proposal of their Academy, Performing Arts Center and academic building. This is Glen Paulson's Hall of Science. Here, Saarinen. This would be Obata's new structure. And it has this really 80s sort of late modern, not postmodern, but not postmodern, it just real corporate feel to it. At the Art Academy, they returned to Swanson, as well as George Zonars, to conceive a number of different iterations of extending the Academy studios to the other side of the Triton Ponds. And then at the Institute of Science, they proposed building a new wing behind the planetarium and then filling in the courtyard behind Saarinen's 2 wings. Now, by this point, 1986, we see the planetarium from 54, the Skillman wing from 64. There's all sorts of sort of appendages. In 66, they added this wing. And so what Obata proposed was simply just turning it into a large box. He wanted to use similar bricks and sort of extend the roof line But Dr. Powder was not happy with this. The board wasn't quite happy with this. No one seemed to be happy with it. So Obata told them to drive over and see his newest building, the Kellogg Company headquarters. Now, as the Cranbrook Coalition goes to see Kellogg, they have a meeting with the building manager who tells them it was over budget, it's expensive to maintain, it's confusing, and it's already falling apart. They go back to Obata, and he says, well, that's not, that they're doing something wrong. And Obata says that this is arts and crafts, that he's incorporated sculpture, he's used traditional materials. He viewed this as a real arts and crafts experiment. Dr. Powder, and this is all from meeting minutes, she accused Obata as not using genius as part of his architectural firm. And she also said that Cranbrook is not a black box in need of filling, and she accused this as being a great empty black box. Dr. Powder asked Goryeobata, how do you decide to expand a building of significance? And he said, you have to decide how much you can spend, and then you work from there. And I think that is probably a great way of conceiving architecture, but it was not the sort of Cranbrook way of conceiving architecture. Obata said that his design had no vision because the Institute had no vision. And those fighting words really led to this falling apart of a relationship. At the same time, Dr. Powder established the Architectural Advisory Committee to sort of get Cranbrook architects who might be a little bit more engaged with academia, a little bit younger, less of a corporate office. And in the notes of the Architectural Advisory Committee, I found these 3 questions that they asked themselves. What are the challenges to architect selections at campuses with significant architectural importance? 2, are name architects more popular now, especially on college, university, and nonprofit institutions? And 3, what are the implications of Cranbrook's modernist versus postmodernist architect selections? And so as the Architectural Advisory Council, which was made up of a Cranbrook trustee, a vice president of CEC, the head of the Cranbrook Academy Architecture Department at the time, Dan Hoffman, and a professional architect, they were asking themselves, how do we build? And they went to an architect and asked his opinion, how do we build? And that architect was Michael Graves, which I would have loved to seen here, sort of stripped classicism, Ailill Saarinen with the 7 dwarves on top. And if Michael Graves is just the ultimate sort of wit and whimsy of postmodernism, they also went to Robert Venturi, and they looked at Venturi and his recent competition-winning orchestra hall for Philadelphia, where he sort of flattens a neoclassical facade into the front of the building, and then puts Moonlight Sonata across the top. And then they also looked at Frank Gehry, who Frank Gehry had again won a competition to design the Walt Disney Music Hall. And so they get this idea that competitions might be the way to go forward, that architects with perhaps greater artistic and intellectual rigor are the way to go. When Ed Bacon, the famous Philadelphia city planner, got word, he sent a letter in archives in huge handwriting, never Gehry, Graves, or Venturi. So he was not quite happy with these ideas. But thinking about question number 2, are name architects more popular now? In 1992, I think name architects were becoming popular. After 1997, with Frank Gehry's Guggenheim, it was the age of starchitecture. And so Cranbrook is making these considerations at the same time that starchitects are starting to build the buildings that will make their career and launch a whole slew of museum bankruptcies later on into the 2000s. Now, the alternative of doing something like this, these sort of search for form buildings, would be to go back to the sort of traditional line, and you have postmodernists like Robert A.M. Stern, who by this point are really leaving postmodernism and the sort of wit and whimsy for full-fledged neoclassicism. So his renovation of a 1970s dining hall into this sort of Jeffersonian classical building. I think that Stern's mode of expression is a perfectly valid and appropriate way of building onto a historic place. but I don't think that a pastiche of Saarinen would have worked. In the same way that Wright, or Frank Lloyd Wright, or Frank Gehry, or even Saarinen were sort of singular geniuses, you can't mine Saarinen's architecture for formal expression in the same way that you can mine Jefferson and academic classicism for a new building. To try and just repeat Saarinen's eclecticism would have been impossible because what he has been doing was so sophisticated. And so we can see certain attempts of it that really verge onto pastiche. So Somerset Collection, at the same moment Cranbrook is rebuilding its redstone building into this sort of art museum facade stuck onto the museum. And I think this would have been the sort of horror of Cranbrook had we chosen to do it. So the first building that comes up for consideration by this new architectural advisory committee that is thinking about all of these names is an addition to Brookside School, which had been built between 1918 and 1939. And they select 4 architects to interview here on campus. First up was Stephen Hull, a New York architect, then Todd Williams and Billie Tsien, again working in New York, but Todd Williams is a graduate of Cranbrook schools. We saw his mother earlier. Then Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, which I think the board were most excited to have that interview. And then Peter Rose, who was a Canadian architect. And they start the interviews with Stephen Hull, who was hot off of a 2-man retrospective in New York City at the Museum of Modern Art. And Hull proposes this very bold scheme that would have bridged Cranbrook Road, put most of the addition on the other side of the street. And he invites them to New York, and so they have this bold proposal. They go and see one of the only buildings that he has built at this moment, and they think this is not right for Brookside. It's a little bit too big of a personality, and it doesn't quite have that charm. And his proposal isn't in keeping with that sweet sort of English village that Brookside already is. Now, Todd Williams and Billie Tsien had nailed their interview, and everyone on the committee is thinking, this is the way to go. Williams went to Cranbrook, he knows Cranbrook, and they fly out to Princeton, and they tour his buildings, they visit the firm, and they again feel, this isn't right for Brookside. It's too sharp and too angular. It was a sort of tightness of construction that they didn't think fit the sort of rambling nature of Brookside. And they also visit a pool house, a little bit of foreshadowing here, that the firm had just finished. And then they interview Venturi and Scott Brown. And Venturi had written his gentle manifesto of postmodernism in 1966, when he made a case for the difficult whole rather than the diagrammatic forms popular at the time. So instead of thinking of Saarinen's fully formed, total buildings, Venturi wanted to celebrate simple structures that declared what they were and sort of the architecture of the everyday. They had published as a couple Learning from Las Vegas, where they celebrated the Strip. They celebrated the everyday architecture of American highways instead of celebrating all of those European modernists. And when they came for the interview to Brookside, what they told the committee was we would start the project by writing Learning from Cranbrook, which is where we would do a study of the subtle common themes through sketches and photos of the campus. The committee ate it up. They were ready to buy the book, Learning from Cranbrook. They flew out to Philadelphia, where they saw the new zoo that the firm had just built. They went to Princeton, where they saw Gordon Wu Hall. And what they loved about Wu Hall was the contextualism of the building without being pastiche, without repeating neo-Gothic architecture. They built this brick building that slipped into the campus and felt new, but felt like it belonged. And on the inside, they found Venturi's and Scott Brown's commitment to all of the fittings and all of the furniture and light fixtures to really speak to that Cranbrook idea. One of the committee's members flew to London to see the new Sainsbury Wing, which was just finishing up construction. They got a tour through the construction site, and when they saw this detail, they thought, this is the architect who can build onto Cranbrook. This is this strange sort of ahistoric smushing together of Corinthian columns, where you see the 1840 building, the columns quite orderly, now just get smushed into the corner of Trafalgar Square. And they were really ready to settle on Venturi, in part because Peter Rose had so bombed his interview. No one liked his interview, and yet they still were doing site visits, and so they flew to Canada to see his new Canadian Center for Architecture. They met with Phyllis Lambert, who had built the Seagram Tower in New York, the heiress of Seagram liquors. And Phyllis Lambert, who had established the center, sang Rose's praises. They were sort of given the red carpet, including being taken through this new, very sort of subtle, sophisticated work of architecture that was, for all intents and purposes, an addition to this older house. But Peter Rose uses modern materials, modern construction to create almost classical forms. So instead of having a traditional molding, he runs these brackets, which then cast shadows down his very rich stone facade. And then you go into the building, and it's again this sort of techno handmade, where you have these railings and bolts that are combined with wood and light. And here you see the juncture of the two buildings. And Dr. Powder is then driven out to a house outside of Montreal, and she sees the domestic architecture of Peter Rose, and she realized this is the person to expand Brookside, because he can handle institutional work, but he can also handle really personal houses. And he's going to be able to expand this sort of magical campus. So Brookside, as it was completed by Henry Booth, rambles along the River Rouge, and what Peter Rose proposes is to scoot his building, hide a very unfortunate gym from the 1960s, and then slip his building in well behind Hedgegate Apartments and the original Brookside. And he would solve the traffic problem with the landscape architect Dan Kiley, building a traffic circle that's completely behind Brookside. And so he's really reorienting the school from being quite close to the road to behind the road. And then along the facade, you see this real continuity from 1918 all the way to 1995. He's keeping the same proportions, the same building height, the same variety. And then as it's constructed, he uses the same color. He uses this sort of pushing and pulling of facades. There are these wonderful moments where you see the brick and the cast stone and then handprints are all worked together. Here's the little drop-off for the very, very young kids, the 3-year-olds. And you see how there's little windows for the children to look out and then larger windows for the adults to look out. It really is sort of perfectly scaled to children. And Rose spent about 2 years studying Brookside in different trips. And here you see that same thing that he had done at the Canadian Center for Architecture, where he's used a beam, sort of very modern steel construction, to support this more traditional element, this combination. It's something that's not quite modern, not quite postmodern. And then the Brookside School handprints are sort of forever stuck in the building. And he went to great lengths to specify elements like this, where you have handmade gutter downspouts and other features. On the inside, he thought about Saarinen's variety of structural systems, and so he deployed a number of different roof structures. And one thing that the committee had asked for was to not have buildings that they were going to be stuck with as always an art room, always a music room. And so he wanted to create a variety of boxes in which the school could evolve and grow. So it's built with traditional beam construction in places, sitting over custom chairs and furniture that were made here by the architecture students at Cranbrook. And then there's other rooms where you see wooden beam construction now with skylights. In other places, you have more steel and concrete block, sort of endless variety in each classroom. Over the main stairway, a sculpture by Carl Millis, so that every Cranbrook building has a Carl Millis. And even down to the lockers with these funny sort of plasma cut, so a technological process, detailing the lockers in much the same way that Saarinen had detailed his doors. It's that same broken line work, now even more broken up. Dan Hoffman of the architecture department sort of added little details to the building, like the logjam arch, and then one of my favorite places, the Pickle Hut on Pickle Island, which was built into the river to give the children another connection to the brook from which the school takes its name. And then you can go in and you can sort of see the sky, you can see the worms. It's this really perfectly built building. And I think it is, of Cranbrook's structures from the 90s, a runaway success to all involved. Next up is the Institute of Science, and we remember all of the conflict with Goryeobata, and so as the committee started thinking about architects, they severed Obata's role in 1991 and interviewed 4 more architects. Todd Williams and Billie Tsien are again given an interview. Morphosis from Los Angeles is given an interview. Ermin Mitchell and Romaldo Garogla from New York City, both Italians, are given a chance. And then Stephen Hull is given another interview. And these architects are much bolder than who had been invited for the Brookside edition, because it was felt by the committee that the Institute lacked a sort of iconographic entrance. If you wanted to go to the art museum, you knew what it looked like, you knew where to go. But they felt the Institute, with all of its appendages, had lost Saarinen's clarity and needed a building from an architect who could build a sort of icon. So we'll discuss the Williams-Tsien proposal in a moment, but going on to Morphosis, Thom Mayne was a pupil of Frank Gehry, who had founded the Southern California Institute of Architecture, SCI-ARC, in 1972, and SCI-ARC was probably the most important sort of architectural theory school in the country in the late 70s. Mayne was known for his temper and for the buildings that were just sort of impossible to conceive and impossible to build. He showed the committee his MTV studios as well as his golf club from Japan. The committee did not go with Thom Mayne. They were very interested in Mitchell Grugela, partly because the lead architect was a Cranbrook School's graduate. This firm was a little bit older. It was not as young of an office, so they felt that from this sort of Saarinen-inspired Kitty Hawk Memorial to the Australian Parliament House, which had just been concluded, to Virginia Air and Space, and especially the IBM Executive Center, that this was a firm that could give Cranbrook a building on budget that would meet their needs and that would be contextual. And Dr. Powder was particularly impressed with IBM and said that photos really didn't do it justice, because what you can't experience in photographs is the way that they wind the building into the landscape. And that was very desirable for CIS because it sat on that hill and wanted to be in touch with the nature that it was so concerned with. In the end, though, after much deliberation, they settle on Stephen Hull. In the announcement of his selection, the CIS News and Views reported, of interest to the project team were the ink stains on his shirt sleeves, indicating his personal involvement in the design process. And so they flew down to Seaside and they saw Stephen Hull's, again, what is this style? Is it modern? Is it postmodern? Is it traditional? It really flitters in that liminal space that was so interesting to the Cranbrook crowd, to his very light wooden structure on Martha's Vineyard, which looked out towards the water. But by this point, at this interview, he could also show them in his studio the plans for the storefront for art and architecture, which was an unair-conditioned, unenclosed structure where those panels peel out and it becomes a sort of event and exhibition space on the sidewalk of New York. And this sort of poetry of Hull's buildings, as much as the ink stains on his sleeves, I think showed the committee that this is an architect who can do a bold form, but can also be very in touch with the sort of experience of architecture. And so they throw away the Obata plan, which had really just filled in the building, And Stephen Hull looks at this rambling, and though it's not as sort of charming as Brookside's rambling structures, he sees this as a series of blocks that he's going to spread out across the landscape and just continue this idea of endless additions down the hill. As he thinks about it more, though, he ends up creating this slipped U shape. So he repeats Saarinen's form, flips it, and then slightly offsets it. And so he connects the Hall of Minerals and the Hall of Man with the new exhibitions. And you'll notice this is a slight slope up. So he not only turns it into a full U shape, but it also is a full ramp. So if you start on the first floor here, you'll end up on the second floor. Notice this is actually a bridge linking to the second floor of Saarinen's building. And here's a photograph montage of his building, connecting to Saarinen's wing and creating that visual icon that the committee was so interested in. Hull works in watercolors, and a lot of his projects start with these watercolors he does in the middle of the night. He is quite a cerebral architect, and so here you see his watercolor of Saarinen with the addition, and then here you see his concept for the lobby of the new institute, with the light sort of cutting through the roof, cutting off corners, very abstract sort of formation of space. And in these construction photos, I think you see that the way that his watercolor was realized by slipping windows into the corners, popping roofs down or ceilings down, and then sliding the lighting into these sort of slots throughout the space. As finished, it complements quite beautifully George Booth's design of the light tower within this laboratory of light behind it. And here you see the two in conversation. Very distinct buildings, but still very complementary. And then as you get closer, you notice the materials are the same Mankato limestone of the Art Museum. So whereas the original institute did not have the limestone, with this new public face, it takes on the more public limestone material. And that bench is just a solid limestone block built into the wall. And then the door handles are all designed by Hull. He's very much in that Saarinen spirit from teacup to city plan. And if you notice anything about the door handle, you'll notice it's the model of the building. And so as you open the door, you are opening the light laboratory and then his wing going back. After you leave the institute, you've seen the dinosaurs, you've seen the fossils, the door handle itself has become fossilized, worn down with the thousands of ages of hands. And the first room you enter is a teaching space. It's called the Light Laboratory, and these are all different ways of creating glass. And so it's rolled glass, pressed glass, poured glass, rippled glass, and they all cast different shadows into what is meant to be a great white room. So right at the door, he starts teaching you about science. Then you come through into the main lobby space, and you see the sort of slippage of ramps and lighting. You get your ticket, and then you head downstairs underneath these lights that are angled at the same angle as the ramp of the floor. And then you see the way that the space in this, before the exhibits were installed, this great ramp of space, skylights above, and then these rich plaster walls and ceilings. And he was very interested in feeling the hand of the workmen making these plaster surfaces. He envisioned that you would start the exhibits going downstairs, and so you go down this shaft of light into a hallway where you see a history of water. So originally there was an exhibits firm that was hired to design the exhibits. Dr. Powder visited their show at the Carnegie Museum, and she wrote a memo back to Cranbrook saying, tacky. And so they were out, and Stephen Hull was in. And so he really supervised the installation of the exhibits. And so they're integrated into the architecture, which is, I think, the right way to do it, the Cranbrook way to do it. The architecture and the instruction are all together. So here we see the different phases of water, from bubbles to different exhibits about water and marine life. And if you look at this skylight, it's actually under this pool of water in the courtyard. And the courtyard, which was designed in conjunction with Peter Osler, the landscape architect, has all of the phases of water. So you have liquid water here, This house, designed by Dan Hoffman, who had done the Pickle Hut as well, is the House of Ice. So there's a hose that runs around the top, and it mists out when it gets below freezing. It's never worked, apparently, but it worked at least once, because there is one picture with the ice. And then after you have water in the liquid state, the solid state, you have the house of the vapor in a gaseous state. And so again, the architecture is teaching. And even out here in the courtyard, Stephen Hull was concerned with every detail. And probably my favorite non-Saarinen design things on the campus are Stephen Hull's light fixtures for the Institute of Science. I mean, they just look like they're going to scurry off somewhere. And they, again, sort of mimic the building without repeating the building in that same way that Saarinen was always able to work at every scale without ever falling into the trap of just repeating a pattern bigger or smaller. They're in conversation across function and size. Next up, Cranbrook is a campus of gates, particularly when Dr. Powder takes over and there is no central road. If you wanted to go from Kingswood to the boys' school, you had to drive down Cranbrook Road to Lone Pine Road and then back into campus. You could not cut across the middle. And so thinking about each institution represented by its own gate, the competition was on for that new woodward access road. This is what the Obata office had proposed, which is a little blurry, but it's essentially George Booth's gate from 1904 to 1908, stretched out, and then these sort of vaguely Carl Millis sculptures on either side of, Lee Iacocca in his box coming into the campus. It was 1985. Moving on to where this road connects, so it slips in across the Taubman property to the Woodward Avenue. And they interviewed now a number of candidates, and this time, instead of having interviews, they made it a competition. And so they asked these architects to design a gate on a plot that had already been selected. The road had already been laid out by JJR, the architect and engineer, and they were told that they should provide a guardhouse, an information booth or stand, a restroom, a public restroom, parking spots, and an icon that would match the ethos of Cranbrook. So what does that mean? They again invite Thom Mayne and Morphosis. They invite Raymond Abraham, an Austrian architect. Here's his Austrian Cultural Forum of 2002. They invite Diana Egrest and Mario Gandolsonis, Argentinian architects working in New York. Here's their house in the Hamptons about the same time. They again invite Todd Williams and Billie Tsien. They invite Dan Hoffman, who is head of the architecture department. And then they invite Mikado Silvetti, who are, again, Argentinians and practiced in Boston. And so the entries came in a wide variety. There were also a number of architects who did not choose to participate. Invited were Tadao Ando, Sverre Finn of Norway, and Herzog and de Meuron. And so a lot of these offices, this would have been their first project in America, and most of these people have gone on to great and illustrious careers. Starting with Thom Mayne and his proposal, it was this visible lantern canopy. Now, his unique style of model making could make it a little hard to read, but this is the ground plane in these openings. This is the road from Woodward Avenue. So you see what he's proposing is this landscape intervention, this huge oval carved into the landscape, and then at the center, sort of accreting, much like the MTV building did, the lantern sort of covering one lane of traffic. If we go forward in his career, we may get a sense of what this could have looked like. Here you see this sort of lantern coming off of the Caltrans building and all of this sort of steel techno architecture. And even closer to home, the Taubman building at LTU is this sort of lantern next to 696. Now, the jury was not fully convinced of the elaborateness of this proposal and not convinced it would be compelling to the viewer coming upon it casually as a visitor to campus. Next was Abraham's proposal, which was this huge mark on the landscape. From Thomas Jefferson's grid of 1804, he takes this exact cardinal point and he stretches it across the lanes of traffic. The jury was not convinced that a great cruciform beam, this is reading from their evaluation, intended to symbolize the coordinates of Jefferson was sufficiently compelling to serve as a symbol of Cranbrook for years to come. Todd and Billie's entry was quite thoughtful, very rich in materials, but the jury felt that it was just too sort of retro. It was too 60s. What I appreciate about their entry is the Saarinen detail. They have the lamp, so indirect lighting. The light is shooting up across what have been metallic ceramic tiles and would have sort of glistened down across the guard booth and entry. Next was Grest and Gandalsonis, which was this sort of spare, minimalist form that the jury felt was too minimalist to represent Cranbrook. Dan Hoffman's entry, the jury was intrigued by it and intrigued by his mode of production, which would have been industry production as opposed to just contractors building it. And he proposed very elaborate systems of technological and sort of features from different industries, making this sort of hydraulic sculpture. The jury was not convinced that it could actually be done, nor were they convinced that the form was appropriate. And the last entry, the Mikado Silvetti entry, was this wall. And the architects wrote that they were offering a wall for which there is no precedent, as it should be. The presence is assertive, power, and politically useful. I don't know what that means. It's a great 90s essay. It's just full of all the buzzwords put together, but you're left thinking, what are you doing? It's still a wall. And so we look at this wall that's meant to represent Cranbrook's openness to the community, an expanded Institute of Science is really driving the need. The Institute suspected that the new wing would bring twice as much vehicular traffic, so they wanted to get the cars off of Lone Pine. And if we look at the wall, it would have been a steel frame system where the bricks were then cast within the steel beams. And notice they're repeating the bricks here directly from the Cranbrook School for Boys. And when you drove in, there would be a moment marked by a speed bump where the wall would compress itself into a perfect square or a perfect framed view. And then on the way out of the wall, you would see limestone panels referring to the art museum. The wall has no front and no back, which they felt was a very Cranbrook expression with all of our sort of Janus-faced buildings. And just to give you a sense of how this might have looked, let's look at their car park at Princeton, which was completed at the same time. And you see the sort of system of bricks fitting within a larger steel structure. And so they were very honest about this, that it was all artifice, that none of this brick was structural, it was all suspended. To them, that represented architecture of 1990. The jury does select this design. They are announced as the winners. Of course, it is not built, but they do eventually build a very similar project at the very tip of Manhattan on the landfill left over from the World Trade Center, this park where you walk through the wall and then you look back through the wall and they're framing views from both sides. So I don't think the concept was a terrible one, but I don't think it was appropriate for Cranbrook. And so the jury was a hung jury. They were not unanimous in their decision. Dr. Powder felt there needed to be a decision announced, so they did announce Mikado Silvetti as the winner, but they did not announce this design as the winner. They worked with the architects to redesign and go through an iterative process. They even went so far as to putting telephone poles across the road to mark how high the different structures would be. But eventually, and I think much to her credit and the board's credit, they decided that this was not the right move for Cranbrook. And so they decided, under some pressure, to abandon the competition type and to abandon the winning entry. And they go back to Dan Hoffman, head of the architecture department, and they ask him to revisit his entry. And he simplifies it down. I think he very much improves it, though if you ask the guards, which I did, they don't like that there is no restroom, so that's one of the parts of minimalizing it. And he turns it into this Y-shaped canopy of copper mesh, which sort of read like wings sitting on the landscape. And it was built using different industries and using student labor. So here you see the pouring of the concrete columns. These tubes were made by a Wisconsin company that supplies piping to nuclear power plants. And so the students in Hoffman truck over to Wisconsin and they work on the fabrication of these pipes. The mesh was made in the city of Detroit by the Phoenix Wire Company that make hydraulic filtration for industrial wastewater treatment plants, but they weave it now in copper, which is the great roofing material of Saarinen at Kingswood. Then the center oval, this Vescus Pisces, which is very slim from one view, and then seen from the side, you see the sweep. And it has custom rolled, curved glass windows, custom glazed brick, and then this curving door that slides open into a cherry plywood interior. So it's built almost like an item, an object of desire, as much as it is an architectural building. And I do think it's really quite striking as you drive down Woodward Avenue, the way that it sits right on the crest of the hill, and the way that it sort of welcomes you in. It is, to my mind, the opposite of a wall. It makes me think, what is there? I want to go there. And thinking back to my first visit to Cranbrook 5 years ago, I just thought, this is the strangest and most wonderful thing I'd ever seen. And it falls so outside of what I thought Cranbrook had, the sort of stone architecture of Saarinen. So I commend him for the accomplishment. Of course, locals about you know that it was referred to as a gas station quite often. This is my favorite gas station in the area, and it does certainly have, from a formal standpoint, a parallel. Now, the entrance opens in late 1995, around the same time that Cranbrook rolls out its new corporate identity from the McCoys. You see this great steel wall, which was manufactured at a shipyard on Lake Erie, which sort of coordinates with this very corporate identity. And then you drive in and you drive over a new bridge, which has these lanterns built by architecture students in the architecture studio. And then the trellis bridge, which is again built in conjunction with Hoffman and the students, Ted Galante, a graduate. And the bridge is sort of woven together, again, sort of traditional craft and modern technology. And then you get to the arrival, which was some concern that this new road dropped you off at this very arbitrary T intersection. And so it was felt the need to add a new element there. Wani Palasma, the Finnish architect, served as the designer of this sort of land art installation that is just too enigmatic to get into details here. But I'm sure that you all know just from driving that the 6 columns lead you to the 6 columns of the museum this way, and the 4 panels of bronze with the solar system cast lead you to the Institute of Science that way. The entire thing is full of meaning. There's an essay that explains it all in the archives. But I think it does show this commitment to building things that are in the liminal space, in between elements of campus, and that every single element of campus is considered, down to the light fixtures, which are designed by Dan Hoffman and fabricated locally. Cranbrook was ready to embark, buying Saarinen-inspired cast concrete fixtures. They were going to cost $3,600. Hoffman said, if you give me that amount of money, I will give you a fixture. And luckily, commend them, Cranbrook agreed. I'm not sure if it worked out. The record doesn't show. But we do get something new. Instead of mimicking Saarinen, we get these potato chips where the light shines up and reflects back down onto the road. And just the level of detail on these, this hand construction, is so exquisite. Of course, as you know, there's 4 different types. There's the sort of frisbee basket type. I took this picture yesterday. They still look great after all these years. And then there is the bollard, which is not so much meant to light the road, but light the path. And so look at these as you go out and just notice the sort of subtle detail. And we have in the archives all the paper models of these as he was folding and figuring out how can I use rolled steel to make lanterns appropriate for Cranbrook. And I think Hoffman's legacy is very well served by these projects. Next, we notice one firm participated in each of these competitions or selections, Todd Williams and Billie Tsien. This experience with the Woodward Avenue entrance gate, the competition that didn't quite work out, I think perhaps change the method of architectural selection. So when it came to choosing the architect for our new athletic complex, Todd Williams and Billie Tsien were selected outright. Todd Williams, as I mentioned, was a graduate of Cranbrook schools. He then went on to get his undergrad, MFA, and MArch at Princeton. And this is his first freestanding building, which is this great wall, and then the house is behind it. As Williams writes, "I saw a great field. It needed nothing, least of all a building, but what it needed was a wall." And he was thinking of Le Corbusier and Corbu's drawing of Hadrian's Villa, this very famous 1911 illustration where Corbu has taken away all the Roman architecture and he just puts a wall across the Italian landscape. Even more than that, I think Williams was thinking of his colleague. Williams was teaching at the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Art and Science in New York under the influential Dean John Haydock, who was one of the great thinkers of architecture in the late 20th century, a theoretician who built almost nothing, but he educated a whole generation of architects. So Williams was on his faculty. Dan Hoffman had studied with him. Daniel Libeskind had studied with Haydock. And so Haydock's Wall House of 1973 influences Williams' Wall House. And so Williams is interested in the sort of space created between these elements, and then he's interested in what goes inside of them. So working with his future wife and partner, Billie Tsien, and Rick Scofidio, he designs this sort of domestic arrangements which were meant to be prototypical walls, beams, ceilings, chairs, elements that you could put in any space and form architecture. So it's a very abstract way of thinking about architecture. A future client sees this and says, if you're interested in making domestic arrangements, would you be interested in making a house? And so the Eisenberg House is one of the first projects by both Todd Williams and his wife, Billie Tsien, who was a Yale undergraduate. And so here, Todd and Billie are interested not so much in the architecture, but in the in-between space and what happens between these elements. Notice that pool there. Todd Williams then goes off to the American Academy in Rome for a summer, and when he comes back, he becomes very interested in structure, in buildings. He was so impacted by the Roman sun and Roman walls that he gets this commission that is not a building, but is a landscape, restoring the seawall at an island on Long Island Sound off the coast of Connecticut. And he's using here Stony Creek granite to form sort of lines in space, to form, again, a swimming pool. And interestingly, the Stony Creek granite are the offcuts of Philip Johnson's AT&T Tower, the great postmodernist Chippendale-topped skyscraper in New York, which Todd Williams has used the offcuts for to create this very abstract landscape feature. Around this time, they build Feinberg Hall, which is their first major structure, a little perfect box for 45 students at Princeton, again defies stylistic categorization. They do the little pool house, which is an addition with a saluette and a swimming pool, where they experiment with water level changes and how does the constant sound of water affect the architecture, and how do you integrate art, architecture, and landscape together. I think all of this is building up to make them uniquely equipped for what comes next at Cranbrook. But on the larger scale, they build an addition at the University of Virginia, which is very abstract. It's sort of Thomas Jefferson broken apart and brought back together again. At the same time, Bob Stern is building a sort of another Thomas Jefferson. So it's sort of two alternative ways of being inspired by an important architectural space. And then out in La Jolla for the Scripps Institute, which you'll remember Ellen Scripps Booth. This is her aunt. Cranbrook's founder's aunt forms the Scripps Institutes. And so Todd Williams and Billie Tsien build the research building, and they're looking at their neighbor, which is Lou Kahn. And so here they're very interested in the materiality of Lou Kahn, his concrete walls, but not just Kahn's sort of masterful cathedral of the Pacific, but also the behind-the-scenes spaces, where the way you have light filtering through these great concrete surfaces, and the way that wood sort of touches on the concrete and the kind of ruinous quality of Liu Kan's work, they try to capture in the Scripps Institute. And I love this great concrete curve and the way it cast a great light circle. They have seemed to have sculpted that circular light beam out of the Southern California sun and made the light part of their architecture. They also are constantly interested in ramps in the way that you change elevation. So here at the Institute, you climb up and back across the ramp. And then a little building out in Troy, New York, where they form a quadrangle where you go up the ramp and into the building. And I think they're looking again at Le Corbusier in the way that he in his own house defines space by using these ramps. So they're taking very iconic modernist sources and reshaping them into sort of a new way of being modern. And so you climb up the ramp, and then you can look out to the athletic fields, or you can go into the building and notice very simple materials, but exquisitely done. So cast concrete block, and then a concrete block with a rougher surface. It's all very cheap, but it's all perfectly done. And then you step inside of this building, and you see that it's a swimming pool of 1998, which how this one firm built so many pools in the first 20 years of their career, I don't know, but we come back to Cranbrook where they would, of course, build our natatorium. The natatorium was part of a larger unbuilt complex. So this is Saarinen's, this is the courtyard of the boys' school, and remember the athletic fields come off of the back. Glen Paulson would build his building here, so that's Gordon Hall of Science. This is the Performing Arts Center. And Williams and Tsien proposed building a new gymnasium between the two Saarinen gymnasiums and then putting a pool slightly further north. And this is what it would have looked like as you came in, saving the Saarinen facade and extending it in this sort of abstract variation. On the inside of that major gym, the roof would be supported by this single beam running across, mirroring the sort of wonderful gym beams of Saarinen's architecture, which of course rested on their solid brick walls. Now, this scheme would not be realized, but one part was, the natatorium, which we see has a bridge connecting to Saarinen's gymnasium, and then a great ramp, and then the space of the pool buried in the hillside. And so when they begin construction, the sort of Saarinen main axis really peters out. There's sort of nothing down here. And so their goal was to complete Saarinen's vista and continue the language of the campus. Most of the architectural decisions were made in George Booth's bedroom at Cranbrook House. So here you see Todd Williams presenting his designs. Here he is out in the field. They had to tear down faculty housing, which used to be a chicken coop, Chanticleer Cottage. And then here we see the building under constructed, and just the labor of saving those trees right behind the building, and then having to build these concrete slurry walls, and then the structure itself is just a steel box. Already we're seeing the circles being framed out in steel. These anchors that are dropping down, these are what will hold the ceiling that you see. On top, there are these tracks, which will come into play in a moment. So those are rails made out of I-beams. The entire natatorium was built with the pool still inside of it because the contractors were worried that if they had excavated the pool on a slope, this entire berm would have been structurally unsound. So they build the building flat, and then they excavate the pool from a completed building. It completes the vista coming from Cranbrook House past the museum all the way down. Peter Osler, the landscape architect, used the excavated body of the pool to add a hill here so that when you're standing at the art museum and you look down the axis, you don't see this new school bus turnaround. It is an English garden ha-ha wall. Next time you're out there, if you don't believe me, just walk down and you will see no school buses, and then they slowly start to become visible. But it continues this major axis from Cranbrook House, George Booth's office, across the West Terrace, up the ramp of the Chinese dog, through the Orpheus Fountain, past the boys' school, and then bam, ending at the natatorium. And just the metaphysical force of all of that causes this kink in the building. And so there is this intersection where the axis has caused a dent in the structure. And these bricks are iron spot Norman-sized bricks, which are slightly longer than a standard brick. The mortar, like Frank Lloyd Wright, has been raked on the horizontal, so it's deeper on the horizontal and flush with the brick on the vertical to increase that horizontal line. Endicott Clay of Nebraska made these, and they used manganese in the body of the brick and then put a glaze on top of the brick. Billie Tsien wanted to be able to see the manganese, the spots on the brick, but all the samples kept coming back and you couldn't see the manganese, you couldn't see it. So they fly down to Endicott in Nebraska and they see the stack of bricks and she picks one up and she says, "This is perfect." And they said, "We didn't send that to you, that's a reject. This is perfect." Luckily, they saved all the recipes and the recipes are in the archive so we can make them again. And it's joining in a larger conversation. So with the General Motors Technical Center, where Arrow used his glazed bricks. And then even with the ceramics department, with Maya Grotel and her famous glaze recipe for Grotel Blue. And then entering into the building, you slip in underneath this canopy, and the canopy is supported by these 3 stainless steel columns in 2 places, which are mirroring directly Alvar Aalto's 3 columns at the Villa Morena. And why are they making these references? You know, modernism was all about getting rid of historical precedent and erasing history. It was machine-focused. But this moment, it's the impact of the postmodern movement. It's the impact of having meaning within your buildings. I also think it's choosing an architect who loves this place and who grew up in this place. And so these connections to the past are so important to include, even though they become quite abstracted on the building. We step inside, and all of the building that you can see is just a ramp with the Honduran mahogany and the sandblasted stainless steel, and then the custom concrete block from Grand Blanc, Michigan, and then you get into the pool with these great oculi or circles above. Those rails that we saw earlier have domes that slide into place, and so you can open the entire pool to the heavens. And then these 15 mahogany doors are on hydraulic pumps, and they swing open, and so the entire pool can cross-ventilate. The air comes in and out through the ceiling. And then the details of it include things like these wonderful tiles, which to my eye repeat the sort of legacy of weaving at Cranbrook and the tapestries that were woven for the campus. And if we look at the map tapestry, we see this sort of lake area, the system of water where the natatorium would eventually be built, and then the tiles used in this almost tapestry-like way. From the outside, the building is quite monolithic. It's so abstract. And then you head inside with the fins open, and it is, again, this sort of architecture of light. Now, we still have one more building to talk about, which is the new studios building. When we last left Saarinen, he had finished the museum wing in 1942, but he had grand plans for additions to the campus. And by the 1960s, the academy was completely strapped for space. By the 70s, it was becoming really untenable, and by the 80s, there were people working in areas where they had to climb over pipes in these tiny little warren of rooms. The ceramics department had a 20-inch stairway to the kiln, and so the students would build their ceramics in the kiln because they couldn't get them out of their studios. And so the pressing need for space called for a proposal from the vision plan, where Robert Saarinen Swanson would have put a new studio to really complete this as a sort of formal space, almost like an Italian piazza. But by the time that they start thinking seriously about it, a number of other art schools have opened or were opening. And so director of the academy, or president of the academy, Roy Slade, he commended the Wexner Center by Michael Eisner, a very controversial building for an art school. At the same time, Frank Gehry had won a competition to build new studios for the Toledo Museum of Art School. But what Roy Slade thought would be most appropriate, he did not want an architecture that would infringe on the students' creativity, like Gehry. And he thought Cranbrook needed to go into the sort of prefabricated systems approach. And I must think he was considering structures like the Unistrut addition to the School of Architecture at Michigan. And that this legacy of Ailill and Eames, or Arrow and Eames, working in prefabricated structures made the most sense, that we should just build a great blank box for the students to work in. And so here's a later design by Swanson where you see these sort of prefabricated structures in this great empty volume of space. But with our process, we have to interview more architects. And so we interview John Haydock, we interview Robert Saarinen Swanson, James Sterling, Aldo Rossi, and Raphael Mineo. And Haydock actually refuses the interview. He comes to campus and then says, I'm not interested in this project. Interestingly, Haydock did design something for Cranbrook, the House of the Poet, which was going to be a visitor's house on Cranbrook's campus. Haydock, ever the theoretician, just designs this wonky building that would have been student-made, and it would have been at the end of Academy Way in the woods, sort of this monster emerging from the woods. I think it's fabulous. I wish we had it. But when Dr. Powder leaves, the project sort of fizzles out. So Haydock is not considered for the new studios. Swanson submits 3 projects for consideration. The Kresge Library, which was designed with his father, J. Robert F. Swanson, at Oakland University. The Art and Architecture Building at the University of Michigan, where they're still located. So art studios here, architecture studios behind. And then the Peggy DeSalle Auditorium that we're in. The next architect considered was Jim Sterling, who is probably most famous for his great trinity of buildings at Oxford and Cambridge, a unique strain of British post-war modernism. But by this point, Sterling, who is the leading thinker of English architecture, he has gotten full on with the postmodern movement. And so his Performing Arts Center at Cornell, the committee flies out to see, they're intrigued by it. One committee member flies to Stuttgart and visits Sterling's most famous and quite wonderful building, the Art Gallery in Stuttgart. And Gil Silverman sends back this photo of himself standing on the building with a note that says, "This was intentional." This is the car park underneath the building, and so this serves as the ventilation for the car exhaust. And then Sterling also submits for consideration his Clore Gallery in addition to the Tate in London. And what I think is interesting about Sterling, because he was seriously considered for the building, and I quite admire this work of postmodernism. Sterling has taken this part of the Tate and he's extended the cornice line, he's extended the materials, and then he sort of breaks them apart and it turns into something different. And much like in Stuttgart, where you have colorful elements that seem to be supporting more traditional architectural elements, it's witty, it's abstract, it's full of historical references. But in the review of all of the contestants, Gerhard Nodell, head of the fiber department, he wrote that the problem with Sterling is his buildings are full of generic architectural references, not appropriate to a place that is full with its own genuine, unique history. It seems inappropriate to encourage an architecture based on generalities. And I think that is the sort of damning word about why would we want to build onto the art museum in a historic style. So instead, we focus on 2 architects, Aldo Rossi, the Italian, who's famous for his columbarium, and who, in his letter accepting his consideration, he references his great Kingswood chimney stack, which he built in 1982. And he was just finishing up work on a new town hall, and Dr. Powder was thoroughly impressed on her visit to Rossi's structures. But then they go to Madrid and they visit with Raphael Mineo, and they see his strain of tactile modernism. And I imagine walking into the National Museum of Roman Art, they were sold. I mean, what an edifice. And look at the date, 1986. It could be 86. This incredible structure. In Mineo's letter accepting the award, he wrote, "Cranbrook conveys a sense of unity, and yet there is a surprising variety of styles, a continuous change reflecting the chronology. I would dare say that this set of buildings is an architectural biography of Saarinen, who, without losing contact with his principles, was always sensitive to problems posed by the passage of time. He continues, "The new building would be one more link in the chain. However, this does not imply that such a link would repeat mimetically the existing physical features. The new building should be an autonomous while sharing in the principles which make Cranbrook possible." That is an architect who gets it. Now, this building is cursed by financing. The money's just not there, so Mineo is sort of sent off. He's dean of Columbia School of Architecture at the time. He builds his first American building at Wesley. He builds a new city hall in Spain. He opens a museum in Houston. He wins the Pritzker Prize in 1996. And so he comes back to campus about 2000. And I want to point out where his structure will be. It's going to be an addition to the museum. And think back to 1925. Saarinen's plan doesn't have any thumbs. It doesn't have any loose buildings. It's all courtyards, whether small or large like a piazza. And so really, this building is unfinished. And it's so unfinished, Saarinen envisioned that he would continue. So here's the museum, the peristyle. Saarinen proposed a dining hall coming here and then dormitories across, turning the Orpheus Fountain in a full quadrangle. Now, Mineo doesn't go in that direction. He's not given the option. But he, instead of building his building out here and trying to turn this very wide space into a quadrangle, he very adroitly turns it into a much smaller quadrangle to the side. And he touches the buildings at this moment where his is so minimal viewed from the pools. His is visible, but it's not intruding. It's an incredibly respectful addition. Under construction, we see here, it's a base of concrete block and then wrapped in structural brick. And then here we see how it touches the Art Academy in this very elegant solution. And then the building was ready to be opened. By this point, Nodell is president or director of the Academy. There are no more presidents. And so always have a fiber person be designer of the opening. Everyone was told to bring scissors. And here we see the architect Mineo with his daughter, who served as the project architect, cutting the ribbon. And then the building itself is this great wall of glass, fiber at the top, ceramics in the middle, metals in the basement, arranged by sort of metaphysical weight, hacking away, light weaving at the top, heavy metal at the bottom. And then as you walk past it, for the first time in the Academy's history, one can see the art being made. The older studios are completely sort of cloistered away, and now you have this suspended curtain wall of glass, and you can see directly into the art-making process. And you slip through Mineo's entrance with this wonderful thin concrete overhang, which is mimicking Saarinen's at the Institute of Science, and you come into this 3-story stair space where you have a gallery for the students on the right-hand side, a gallery for the museum above, linking together the students and the museum. They are one division, one entity, and then the studios to the left. And on the opposite end, you have the artist in residence. These are the master artisans who are influencing the students, and they're the sort of cornerstone of the Cranbrook educational model, and so they're at the corner of the building. And then this great sort of metallic wrapped factory at the end. And Mineo was nervous about this, whether this would fit onto the campus, because it seems so different from what Saarinen had created. But in the end, he realized that he was simply extending in a logical way Saarinen's architectural vocabulary. And inside of the factory, these chimneys connect to the kilns and the hot shop below, and all of these were modern industrial equipment. And so the Academy was getting closer to industry, the buildings getting closer to industry. And so his studios, which are light and airy and empty in that way that Roy Slade said the studio needed to be empty. It did not need to be an architecture that came at the student, but that allowed the student to fill the space. With the new studios opening, the old studios could be reclaimed and brought back to some semblance of their glory. 3 departments move out, and Saarinen's historic architecture is restored and still used. But the difference between Eliel Saarinen at the end of his career, he is building the end of Cranbrook. And he has those other projects, but he doesn't keep building. By Cranbrook choosing these modern architects, they do keep building. These were young people at the beginning of their career. And so as we run over time, I want to look a little bit at these architects and what they do after Cranbrook, because I think it's interesting that in almost every case, except for Mineo, who came to Cranbrook with his Pritzker, all of these other architects, this really scoots their career along. Peter Rose continues to build additions and houses. He inserted a gallery at Harvard within the Le Corbusier building. Here, a recent project by Peter Rose where he took a Tudor house and he renovated it. We will not have him do any work at Cranbrook House. Stephen Hull, his career really takes off from the Institute of Science about the same time he builds Finland's new Museum of Modern and Contemporary Architecture. And notice what he's looking towards here, Saarinen's National Museum. So he is the sort of opposite. He goes back to Europe to build from America. And then one of his great masterpieces, the addition to the Nelson Atkins, where he uses the same channel glass that all of the skylights and walls of the Institute were built. Now it is only channel glass and then white plaster on the inside. He's done a number of different art schools, including my favorite, the University of Iowa, which I think is continue to explore the sort of planes and structure that we saw at the Institute of Science. And most recently, his buildings at Princeton, the School of Music during the day and then during the night, where you see the underground edition expressed through the water. Todd Williams and Billie Tsien, their career 2 launches, and so they build the Folk Art Museum in New York, which has this cast bronze facade, and then the inside is this very idiosyncratic sequence of spaces, but of course it was cursed by being built next to MoMA, and so it has been torn down for the Museum of Modern Art. And then the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, where you see, just like at the Natatorium, how they brought light in giant circles. Here they bring light in through this bar of light and then wrapping it into this space. Variations on themes of bringing light in are at Lincoln Center, where they again use the circles sort of poking through this alleyway. More recently at Central Park, another athletic facility with a great blue roof. This time it's for ice skating, so whereas the Natatorium just has the sort of star fields, now we have star fields with these sort of skaterly constellations going across. And they still are building pools here in India. And notice the way that even though it's open air on the sides, there's still this interest in how do you bring light from the roof into the space. And they're, of course, building the Barack Obama Library in Chicago. Mineo, about the same time, I think the same month that he opens the new studios, he opens the cathedral in Los Angeles, and then famously opens the addition to the Prado. Now, Cranbrook has built since these structures we looked at tonight. So this is the public school that the Booths donated to the city of Bloomfield Hills, designed by Saarinen's son-in-law, J. Robert F. Swanson. It was added on to in 2007 by Simmons Associates. There's an Institute of Science edition by Dan Hoffman, who does not build within the sort of Cranbrook color story or technology or really anything that makes it a Cranbrook quality of construction. There's the Girls Middle School by Lake Flato, who are Texas architects. And then there's the collections wing here at the Art Museum. And all of these structures came in with much less drama than any of the 4 that we saw. They came in on time and on budget, but I'm not sure that any of them capture that energy and that real sort of richness of architectural expression and searching. The architect, I don't think, really looked for what it meant to be building a middle school or what it meant to be building at Cranbrook. They sort of picked and chose different Cranbrook materials and cobbled them in together into a very nice middle school. But I think that these buildings that we looked at tonight, as George Booth liked to say, a life without beauty is only half lived. And for the mid-century modernists, those like Eero Saarinen, a word like beauty was really toxic. Eero Saarinen probably wanted to use it, and I think his buildings are often quite beautiful. But beauty was not something a modernist could consider themselves with. Postmodernists like Venturi allowed architects to again consider things like beauty, craft, tradition, and meaning. And those are the things that were so valued by Booth and by Saarinen. And I think those same elements, craft, tradition, meaning, and beauty, were quite important to each of the architects working here at the end of the last century. So in reviewing our history of architecture from Cranbrook House of 1908 to the Museum of 42 and what we saw today, I think it is a remarkable legacy. I think it is a singular place. I think it is a really rare thing that we have here and that we are stewards of and that we get to enjoy, but that we also get to build onto and maintain. And so as we think about the future and as we think about the more recent past, we have to remember that all of these buildings were built for a purpose, and they were built for teaching. Someone once asked a faculty member, how do we get another golden age at Cranbrook? If we had the 30s, we had the late 80s, how do we get another golden age? And their response was, go buy 300 acres of empty land and start building again. I don't know if I'm that cynical. I don't know if that's necessary, but I do think that the fervent excitement that came with Saarinen in this almost cathedral village of constructing the campus in the 30s led to the success of the 30s. And the energy that came in the 90s with these buildings helped propel Cranbrook into the 21st century. And so as we think back over all of the buildings that we saw and everything that's here, I want to encourage you to do everything that you can if you're a student, if you're a supporter, if you're invested in Cranbrook, to continue this legacy of excellence in art, science, and education. And that includes caring for these buildings and being diligent about those buildings that inevitably will come in the future. The legacy that George Booth left us with is, I think, summed up in this open-ended quote: very great values in life are found in the aim, the effort, and even in the struggle to achieve an object worthwhile. Thank you.